The frigid January wind cut through the streets of Chicago like a knife, whipping between buildings and stinging the faces of those unfortunate enough to be outside. Elena Morales pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped off the train at Union Station, her small leather suitcase clutched in her gloved hand. The journey from New Mexico had been long, and her body ached with exhaustion. At 22, Elena had never imagined she would travel so far north, especially during winter. But the telegram from her estranged uncle, Ricardo Morales, had left her little choice. As the last surviving member of her immediate family, the news of her wealthy uncle's illness and his request for her presence had been unexpected. The promise of a substantial inheritance had been impossible to ignore, especially given her dire financial circumstances. "Miss Morales?" A tall man in a black coat approached her, his face partially obscured by a thick scarf. "I'm Thomas Hayes, your uncle's attorney. Mr. Morales sent me to collect you." Elena nodded, studying the man's weathered face. His eyes were deep-set and calculating, watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "How is my uncle?" she asked, following Hayes to a waiting motorcar, a luxury she had rarely experienced. "Dying," Hayes replied bluntly as he opened the passenger door. "But he's held on longer than the doctors expected. He's been waiting for you." As they drove through the snow-covered streets, Eleanor watched the city unfold before her. Massive buildings stretching toward the grey sky, streets crowded with automobiles, and people bundled against the cold. Chicago was unlike anything she had seen before, so different from the small New Mexican town she had called home. "Your uncle's estate is in Lincoln Park," Hayes explained, navigating through the traffic. "It's one of the finest properties in the area. The Morales family has been prominent in Chicago business circles for nearly 30 years. Elena had heard stories about her uncle from her father, though they were rarely complimentary. Ricardo had left their small family home at 18, cutting ties with his brother and building a fortune in the meatpacking industry. The brothers hadn't spoken in decades before her father's death 3 years earlier. The motorcar turned onto a tree-lined street where massive stone mansions stood like sentinels behind wrought-iron gates. Hayes slowed as they approached the largest property at the end of the street, a 3-story Victorian mansion with imposing turrets and darkened windows that seemed to watch their approach. "Morales Manor," Hayes announced as the gates swung open. "You're home now, assuming you meet your uncle's conditions." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What conditions?" Hayes parked the car and turned to face her, his expression inscrutable. "Mr. Morales will explain everything himself. But I should warn you, there have been incidents in the house. The staff is understandably on edge." "Incidents?" Elena asked, but Hayes was already exiting the vehicle. As she stepped out, Elena looked up at the mansion's facade. A curtain moved in a second-floor window, though she couldn't make out who was watching. The house seemed to loom over her, its shadow stretching across the snow-covered lawn like reaching fingers. "They're waiting for you," Hayes said, gesturing toward the massive oak doors that opened as they approached. An elderly woman in a housekeeper's uniform stood in the doorway, her lined face stern as she assessed Elena. "Miss Morales," she said with a slight curtsy. "I'm Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper. Your uncle is upstairs. He's been asking for you since dawn." As Eleanor crossed the threshold, the heavy door closed behind her with an ominous thud. The grand foyer was dimly lit by electric lamps that cast long shadows across marble floors and wood-paneled walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced men and women. Her ancestors, she presumed. "This way," Mrs. Crawford instructed, leading Eleanor toward a sweeping staircase. As they ascended, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were following her, not just from the portraits, but from somewhere else in the house. She glanced back and caught a glimpse of a small figure disappearing around a corner on the first floor. "Who else lives here?" Elena asked. Mrs. Crawford's back stiffened. "Just the staff. Myself, the cook, 2 maids, and the groundskeeper. And Mr. Hayes, of course, though he has his own quarters in the East Wing." They reached the second floor, where the corridor stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors. Mrs. Crawford led her to the end of the hallway, stopping before an ornately carved door. "He's very weak," the housekeeper warned in a hushed tone, "and he may say things that sound strange. The medication affects his mind." She hesitated, then added, "Whatever he asks of you, remember you can always leave. The inheritance isn't worth—" She stopped abruptly as the door opened from within. A nurse in a crisp white uniform appeared, her face expressionless. "Mr. Morales is ready for his niece," she announced, stepping aside to allow Elena entry. Elena took a deep breath and stepped into the dimly lit bedroom, where the smell of illness and medicine hung heavy in the air. As the door closed behind her, she approached the massive four-poster bed, where a frail figure lay propped against pillows. Ricardo Morales's sunken eyes opened, fixing on her with startling clarity. "Elena," he whispered, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested, "you've finally come. Now we can begin." Ricardo Morales looked more corpse than man as he lay against the satin pillows, his skin yellowed and stretched tight over pronounced bones. Only his eyes retained any semblance of life, dark and intense. They followed Elena's every movement as she approached his bedside. "You look like your grandmother," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "She had the same eyes, the same potential." Elena remained standing at the foot of the bed, uncertain how to respond to this man who was both family and stranger. "You wanted to see me, Uncle. Your telegram said it was urgent." Ricardo's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Straight to business. Good." He gestured weakly toward a chair beside the bed. "Sit. What I have to tell you will take time, and mine is running short." As Elena settled into the velvet chair, the nurse silently exited the room, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt final. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the strengthening wind. "Do you know anything about our family's history?" Ricardo asked, his gaze unwavering. "Only what Father told me, that you came north, built a business in meatpacking, and never looked back." A wheezed laugh escaped Ricardo's throat. "Your father always did simplify things." He reached for a glass of water on the nightstand, his hand trembling so violently that Elena had to help him drink. "The Morales fortune wasn't built on just meat, child. We deal in rarer commodities." Elena frowned. "I don't understand." "The family business extends back to Spain, before our ancestors came to the New World. We have always been keepers of certain traditions, facilitators of exchange." He paused, studying her reaction. "Your father rejected this legacy. He called it evil, fled to New Mexico, changed his name slightly, but you cannot escape blood." An uncomfortable prickle ran down Elena's spine. "What kind of traditions?" Ricardo ignored her question. "I have no children of my own. The family line, the true line, ends with me, unless you accept your birthright." His hand shot out suddenly, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "The house needs an heir. It has chosen you." Elena tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "What house?" "This house. This house is merely a vessel, like this failing body of mine." Ricardo's eyes seemed to burn with feverish intensity. "Beneath us lies the true Morales legacy. A chamber built by our great-grandfather when he first came to this country. A sacred space where the veil between worlds thins." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather settled in Elena's bones. The ramblings sounded like the delusions of a dying man, yet the conviction in his voice was unsettling. "You're not making sense, Uncle," she said gently, trying again to free her wrist. His grip finally relaxed, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. "In the desk drawer," he whispered. "The key to the basement door. Take it. Tonight, when the house sleeps, you must go down alone, see what waits for you there." Before Elena could respond, the bedroom door opened, and Mrs. Crawford entered with a tray bearing medicine bottles and a steaming bowl of broth. "Time for your medication, Mr. Morales," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ricardo's eyes never left Elena's face. "Tonight," he repeated. Or forfeit everything. Mrs. Crawford set the tray down and gave Elena a pointed look. Your uncle needs rest now. I've had a room prepared for you in the west wing. Relieved for the interruption, Elena stood. We'll talk more when you're stronger, Uncle. As she turned to leave, Ricardo called out, Ask Mrs. Crawford about the children, Elena. Ask her why no one in the neighborhood allows their children near this house anymore. The housekeeper's face went rigid, her hands tightening around the medicine bottle until her knuckles whitened. That's quite enough, sir, she said through clenched teeth. You're upsetting yourself. In the hallway, Elena found herself alone, Ricardo's words echoing in her mind. She glanced toward the staircase leading down to the first floor, then in the opposite direction where Mrs. Crawford had indicated her room would be. Instead of heading to her quarters, she made her way toward the stairs, determined to explore the house that might soon be hers. The main floor was silent as she descended, the staff seemingly occupied elsewhere. Elena wandered through the formal dining room with its massive table that could seat 20, past a music room where a grand piano stood draped in dust covers, and into a wood-paneled library with shelves reaching to the ceiling. It was there she noticed a small door, partially hidden behind a tapestry. It was locked, but appeared to lead downward, perhaps to the basement Ricardo had mentioned. As she examined it, the floorboards behind her creaked. Elena whirled around to find a girl of about 10 standing in the library doorway. She wore a plain grey dress, her dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, and her eyes, large and solemn, watched Elena with undisguised suspicion. "Who are you?" Elena asked, startled by the child's silent approach. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll be angry." "Who will be angry?" "My uncle." The girl shook her head slowly, backing away. "Not him. The other one. The hungry one." Her gaze flicked toward the hidden door. "You shouldn't go down there. No one comes back from there." Before Elena could question her further, heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. The girl's eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly slipped behind a bookcase just as Thomas Hayes appeared in the doorway. "Miss Morales," he said, his tone suggesting surprise, though his eyes remained calculating. "I see you're exploring, finding everything to your satisfaction." Elena glanced toward the bookcase where the girl had hidden, but saw no sign of her. "Who is the child I just saw? Mrs. Crawford said there were no children in the house." Hayes's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "There are no children here. Perhaps the journey has tired you more than you realized." He gestured toward the hallway. "Allow me to show you to your room. Dinner will be served at 7, though your uncle rarely joins the table these days." As Eleanor followed him from the library, she glanced back once more. The tapestry covering the basement door swayed gently, as if disturbed by a draught, or by someone slipping behind it. Elena's room in the west wing was spacious but oppressive, with heavy velvet drapes blocking most of the fading daylight. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood matching the other antique furniture that crowded the room. Despite the crackling fire in the hearth, a persistent chill seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. After Hayes left, Elena unpacked her meager belongings, then sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of her uncle's cryptic words and the strange encounter in the library. The child had seemed genuinely frightened. Yet Hayes insisted no children lived in the house, and what had Ricardo meant about the children that neighbors kept away? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Crawford entered bearing a silver tray with tea and sandwiches. "I thought you might prefer a light meal in your room tonight," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "The first night in a new place can be unsettling." Elena watched as the older woman efficiently arranged the tea things. "Mrs. Crawford, my uncle mentioned something about children and this house. What did he mean?" The housekeeper's hands stilled momentarily. "Your uncle's mind wanders. The illness, you understand." "I saw a girl downstairs," Eleanor pressed, "in the library, about 10 years old with dark hair." Mrs. Crawford's face paled slightly as she straightened. "There are no children in this house, Miss Morales. Not anymore." "What do you mean, not anymore?" The housekeeper moved toward the door. "This house has stood for almost 50 years. Many families have lived here before the Morales purchased it. Perhaps you saw—" She hesitated. "Well, old houses have their stories." "You're suggesting I saw a ghost?" Elena asked incredulously. Mrs. Crawford's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm suggesting that journey fatigue and unfamiliar surroundings can play tricks on the mind." She paused at the doorway. "I recommend staying in your room tonight, Miss Morales. The house can be confusing after dark. Some doors are better left closed." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor picked at the sandwiches, her appetite diminished by the strange atmosphere of the house. As twilight deepened into night, the wind outside strengthened, howling around the eaves and rattling the windows. Occasionally, she thought she heard other sounds beneath the storm, footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, and once what sounded like a child's laughter, quickly silenced. Unable to settle, Eleanor decided to explore further. She remembered her uncle's instructions about the key in his desk drawer and the basement door. While she had no intention of venturing into a basement alone at night, finding the key might provide some answers. Eleanor cracked open her bedroom door and peered into the darkened hallway. Gas lamps cast pools of dim light at intervals, but deep shadows lurked between them. Seeing no one, she slipped out and made her way toward the main staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner. Ricardo's bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. Elena moved cautiously, freezing at every creak of the old house. As she neared her uncle's room, she noticed light spilling from beneath the door and heard low voices inside, the nurse speaking with someone else, possibly Heirs. "Deteriorating quickly," a male voice was saying. "He won't last the week." "And the girl?" This was the nurse's voice, clinical and dispassionate. "Will she cooperate?" "She has no idea what's expected of her. Once Ricardo is gone—" Elena stepped back, accidentally bumping against a small table. A porcelain figurine teetered and fell, shattering on the hardwood floor with a crash that seemed deafening in the quiet house. The voices inside Ricardo's room immediately ceased. Elena turned and fled, not toward her room, but down the main staircase, seeking somewhere to hide. The library seemed the obvious choice. She could conceal herself among the stacks until the search for her inevitably died down. As she slipped inside the darkened room, Eleanor noticed a faint glow coming from behind the tapestry where she'd seen the basement door earlier. Moving closer, she realized the door now stood slightly ajar, a dim light flickering from whatever lay beyond. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Someone was coming. Without time to find another hiding place, Elena slipped behind the tapestry and through the partially open door, pulling it nearly closed behind her. She found herself at the top of a narrow stone staircase that spiraled downward, illuminated by what appeared to be candlelight from below. The footsteps entered the library. Elena held her breath, pressing herself against the cold stone wall of the stairwell. A moment later she heard Hayes's voice. "Check the study and the conservatory." She couldn't have gone far. Another voice responded affirmatively, and the footsteps receded. Elena exhaled slowly, then turned her attention to the staircase below. Common sense told her to wait until the search moved to another part of the house, then return to her room. But curiosity, and her uncle's insistence that the answers to her questions lay beneath the house, pulled her forward. Placing her hand against the damp stone wall for balance, Eleanor began to descend. The staircase curved tightly, preventing her from seeing more than a few steps ahead. The air grew increasingly cold and damp as she made her way down, carrying a musty scent tinged with something metallic and unpleasant. After what seemed like too many steps for a standard basement, the staircase ended in a small landing before a heavy wooden door bound with iron. It stood partially open, golden candlelight spilling through the gap. From beyond came the soft murmur of voices, not conversing, but chanting in what sounded like Latin or Spanish, too indistinct to make out the words. Elena hesitated, suddenly aware of the foolishness of her actions. She was alone in a strange house, having followed an unknown passage to what was clearly a private gathering of some sort. The smart choice would be to retreat upstairs and forget what she'd seen. As she turned to go back, a small, cold hand grasped hers. Elena barely suppressed a scream as she found herself face to face with the girl from the library. In the dim light, the child's features seemed sharper, her eyes larger, and reflecting the distant candlelight like a cat's. "You shouldn't be here," the girl whispered, her voice urgent. "Not yet. Not until you understand." "Understand what?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "Who are you? What is this place?" The girl glanced fearfully toward the partially open door. "My name was Margaret. I was the first." She tugged at Elena's hand, pulling her away from the door. "You need to see what happens to the chosen ones before you make your choice." "The first what?" Eleanor resisted the pull, her fear giving way to confusion and a growing sense of dread. "What choice?" Margaret's grip tightened painfully. "To become one of the Morales heirs." Her free hand reached for the iron door handle. "Look, see what waits for you." Before Elena could protest, Margaret pushed the door wider, revealing the chamber beyond. The basement room was vast, far larger than should have been possible given the dimensions of the house above. Stone pillars carved with intricate symbols supported a ceiling lost in shadows. Dozens of candles in iron holders provided the only light, casting wavering shadows across the walls where more symbols had been painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and around it 5 figures in hooded robes formed a circle. One pulled back his hood, revealing himself as Thomas Heirs. In his hands he held a leather-bound book, from which he read in a language Elena didn't recognize. On the altar lay a child, a boy no more than 7 or 8, his wrists and ankles bound with rope, his eyes wide with terror. "The ceremony is about to begin," Margaret whispered, her voice hollow. "The same ceremony they performed with me, and all the others before. Your uncle grows stronger after each one, his life extended, but even that power fades eventually." Horror rooted Elena to the spot as Heirs raised a curved blade that gleamed in the candlelight. The other robed figures began a rhythmic chant that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "We have to help him," Elena gasped, finally finding her voice. "We have to stop them." But when she turned to Margaret, the girl was gone. In her place stood only empty air, and behind her, blocking the staircase, was Mrs. Crawford, her kindly demeanor replaced by cold determination. "You shouldn't have come down here, Miss Morales," the housekeeper said quietly. "Not until you were properly prepared." She gestured toward the ceremony. "But perhaps it's better this way. Now you can see what it means to be a true Morales." Mrs. Crawford's hand clamped around Eleanor's wrist with surprising strength for a woman of her age. "Don't make a sound," she warned, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic chanting from the chamber. "The ritual cannot be interrupted once it's begun." Elena tried to pull away, her eyes fixed on the terrified child strapped to the altar. "This is madness. We have to help him." "Help him?" Mrs. Crawford's laugh was bitter. "Child, you don't understand what's happening here." She dragged Eleanor toward an alcove partially hidden in shadow. "Watch. Learn what your family truly is." Below them, Heirs raised the curved blade higher, the chanting growing more intense. The other robed figures swayed in unison, their voices blending into a single droning sound that seemed to press against Elena's ears like a physical force. "In nomine Morales, accipimus hoc sacrificium," Heirs intoned. "Sanguis vitam dat." Eleanor didn't need to understand Latin to comprehend the horrific intent. She lunged forward, but Mrs. Crawford's grip tightened painfully. "You cannot stop it," the housekeeper hissed. "No more than I could stop them when they took my son 40 years ago. No more than any of us could." Before Eleanor could process this revelation, movement near the altar caught her attention. A 6th robed figure had entered from another doorway, a tall, straight-backed man moving with purpose. As he approached the altar, the other participants fell silent, bowing their heads in deference. The newcomer pulled back his hood, revealing a face Elena recognized instantly. Though it was impossible, Ricardo Morales stood before the altar. Not the frail invalid she had met upstairs, but a robust man in his prime, his eyes burning with vitality. "Uncle," Elena whispered, disbelieving. "Mrs." Crawford nodded grimly. "The true Ricardo. What you saw upstairs is merely what remains when the power fades between ceremonies." She gestured toward the boy on the altar. "Each sacrifice buys him another month of strength, of youth. He has lived this way for nearly 60 years. Elena watched in horror as Ricardo took the blade from Heirs. The boy on the altar had fallen silent, his eyes glazed with terror beyond screaming. "But why children?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. "Innocence holds power," Mrs. Crawford replied matter-of-factly. "The more innocent the sacrifice, the greater the yield." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "In the beginning, Ricardo took only the unwanted, orphans, runaways, children no one would miss. But as his needs grew, as the intervals between ceremonies shortened, he required fresher sources." Elena felt bile rise in her throat. "And you help him? After what he did to your son?" Mrs. Crawford's face twisted with a mixture of grief and resignation. "He owns us all, Miss Morales. The house binds us to its service, the living and the dead alike." She nodded toward the shadows where other small figures had begun to materialize, ghost children, dozens of them, watching the ceremony with hollow eyes. Among them stood Margaret, her form more transparent than the others. "This is what happens to the chosen ones," Margaret's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind, rather than her ears. "We feed the house with our blood, and the house feeds on our souls afterward." Below, Ricardo had begun another incantation, the blade hovering over the boy's chest. Eleanor couldn't bear to watch what would happen next. She wrenched herself free from Mrs. Crawford's grip and stumbled back toward the staircase. "You cannot escape your heritage," the housekeeper called after her. "The house has chosen you as the next keeper. When Ricardo finally dies, you will take his place, or the binding will claim all our souls." Eleanor fled up the winding stairs, tears blinding her as she heard a collective moan rise from the chamber below. Whether from the living participants or the ghostly observers, she couldn't tell. She burst through the library door, startling a maid who dropped her feather duster with a small cry. "Miss Morales, are you ill?" the young woman asked, taking in Eleanor's tear-streaked face. "I need to leave," Eleanor gasped. "Now. Tonight." The maid's expression shifted from concern to resignation. "No one leaves Morales Manor unless the master permits it," she said softly, backing away. "I should tell Mr. Heirs you're upset." "No!" Elena grabbed the maid's arm. "Please, you must help me. What's happening in this house is evil." For a moment, sympathy flickered across the maid's face. "The last girl who tried to leave was found hanging from the oak tree in the garden," she whispered. "The house doesn't release what belongs to it." With that, she pulled away and hurried from the library, leaving Eleanor alone among the shadows that suddenly seemed alive with malevolent intent. The tapestry covering the basement door began to sway, though there was no draft. Eleanor backed toward the library exit, then turned and ran toward the main entrance. The massive front doors were locked, as were the windows she tried next. Frantically, she searched for another way out, moving from room to room, only to find every potential escape sealed. As she entered the conservatory at the back of the house, Eleanor nearly collided with Heirs. His ceremonial robe was gone, replaced by his usual somber suit, but a small crimson stain marred his otherwise immaculate white cuff. "Miss Morales," he said smoothly, as if they were meeting for afternoon tea, "your uncle is asking for you. The ceremony has left him quite drained, but he insists on speaking with you immediately." Elena backed away, revulsion evident on her face. "I know what you did, what you're all doing." Heirs sighed, showing no surprise at her accusation. "Then you understand the importance of your role here. The Morales legacy must continue." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You have a choice, Elena. Become the keeper willingly, with all the power and wealth that entails, or join the bound souls who serve this house for eternity. I would rather die, Elena spat. That can be arranged, Hayes replied calmly. But it wouldn't release you from the binding. Nothing can, except fulfilling your purpose. He gestured toward the doorway. Come, Ricardo will explain your options more thoroughly. Seeing no immediate escape, Elena allowed Hayes to guide her back through the house toward the main staircase. As they passed the front entrance, she noticed something she had missed before. A small iron key in the lock, tantalizing in its promise of freedom, yet impossibly out of reach with Hayes at her side. They ascended to the second floor, not toward Ricardo's bedroom, but to a door Elena hadn't noticed during her earlier exploration. A narrow wooden door with strange symbols carved into its frame, similar to those she had seen in the basement chamber. Hayes knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished with only a simple bed, a chair, and a small table bearing a single candle. On the bed lay Ricardo, once again the frail old man she had met earlier, his skin grey and drawn tight across his skull. "Leave us," Ricardo commanded, his voice a rasping whisper. Hayes bowed slightly and withdrew, closing the door behind him. Elena heard the distinct click of a key turning in the lock. "You've seen what lies beneath," Ricardo stated, his sunken eyes fixing on her face. "You've seen the source of our family's power." "I've seen murder," Elena replied, remaining near the door, as far from her uncle as the small room allowed. "Sacrificing children for your own unnatural life." Ricardo's dry lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Judgment from one who knows nothing of necessity. The binding was not my creation, girl. It existed long before the first Morales discovered it, a door to power that our ancestor was simply wise enough to use." "What binding? What are you talking about?" Ricardo gestured weakly toward the walls, where Elena now noticed more symbols, painted in faded red. "This house stands on ground that was sacred long before Chicago existed. The native tribes avoided it, calling it a hunger place. The Spanish missionaries who first settled here disappeared without trace. When our great-grandfather built this mansion in 1865, he discovered the chamber below and the entity that dwells within it." Elena shook her head in disbelief. "You expect me to believe some creature demands child sacrifices?" "Not a creature," Ricardo corrected. "A doorway, a passage between worlds that requires payment to remain open." He struggled to sit up, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "The arrangement is simple. We provide regular sacrifices, and in return, we receive power, wealth, influence. The keeper, myself, receives the greatest boon, extended life." "And now you want me to become this keeper?" Elena asked, disgust evident in her voice. "You are the last of the Morales bloodline. Only family can serve as keeper." Ricardo's eyes burned with feverish intensity. "My power wanes. Tonight's ceremony was the last I can endure. The transfer must happen before I die, or the binding will take all within these walls, including you." "I will never participate in murder," Eleanor stated firmly. Ricardo's laugh turned into a racking cough. When he recovered, he fixed her with a calculating stare. "Such moral certainty. But consider the alternative. If you refuse, every soul in this house, living and dead, will suffer eternally. The children already bound will never find peace, and new keepers will eventually emerge, continuing the cycle without the restraint our family has shown." "Restraint?" Eleanor echoed incredulously. "We take only what is needed," Ricardo insisted. "One child each month. Others who have discovered the binding were not so economical." Elena turned away, sickened by his justifications. Her gaze fell on the small window, where frost patterns sprawled across the glass like grasping fingers. Beyond lay darkness and the promise of freedom, if she could only reach it. "You have until dawn to decide," Ricardo said, apparently reading her thoughts. "Accept your inheritance willingly, or join the bound. There is no third option. A soft knocking at the door interrupted them. Hayes's voice came through. "Mr. Morales, the doctor has arrived for your evening examination." Ricardo's eyes never left Elena's face. "Think carefully, niece. Dawn comes quickly in winter." As Hayes unlocked the door, Elena slipped past him and fled down the hallway toward her assigned room, her mind racing with the impossible choice before her. Elena paced the confines of her bedroom, the ornate furniture and luxurious fabrics suddenly seeming like the trappings of a beautifully appointed prison. She had tried the window, locked of course, and the door, which opened freely to the hallway but led nowhere safe. The entire house was sealed against escape, and outside, the Chicago winter night would be deadly to anyone unprepared for its bitter cold. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the silent house. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. There had to be a way out, not just for her, but for the bound souls Ricardo had spoken of, especially the children. "They won't let you leave." Elena's head snapped up at the whispered words. Margaret stood by the fireplace, her translucent form flickering like a candle flame in a draught. In the better light of the bedroom, Elena could see details she had missed before. The old-fashioned cut of the girl's dress, suggesting she had died decades ago, and a dark stain spreading across the front of the fabric. "Margaret," Elena acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice steady. Are all the children still here? In the house?" The ghost nodded solemnly. "We're bound to it. To him. Our blood feeds the doorway, and our souls maintain it." She drifted closer, her footsteps making no sound on the plush carpet. "I was the first in 1867. Master Morales, the first one, found me begging on the street. He offered me food and shelter." Her small face twisted with remembered betrayal. "I thought he was kind." Elena's heart ached for the child and all the others who had followed. "How many of you are there?" 57, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "One each month, mostly. Sometimes 2 when the hunger grows stronger." Elena felt ill. Nearly 5 decades of murdered children, their souls trapped in this terrible house. "There must be a way to free you," she insisted, "to end this." Margaret's form wavered, like a reflection in disturbed water. "Only the Keeper can release us, or destroy the doorway forever." Her eyes, hollow pools of shadow, fixed on Elena. "But no Keeper has ever chosen to surrender the power. And destroying the doorway requires—" She trailed off, looking away. "Requires what?" Elena pressed. "A different kind of sacrifice," came another voice from the shadows by the wardrobe. A boy stepped forward, older than Margaret, perhaps 13 or 14. Unlike her, his clothes were more modern, suggesting a more recent death. A thin red line circled his throat. "I'm William," he introduced himself with a formal little bow. 1906. "I tried to escape after seeing what they did to the others. Mr. Hayes caught me on the grounds." His fingers touched the mark on his neck. "He said my death wouldn't count for the ritual, but it would serve as a warning to others." More children began to appear throughout the room, some barely visible, others almost solid enough to be mistaken for the living. They ranged from toddlers to teenagers, their clothing spanning decades. The ghost children encircled Eleanor, their translucent forms casting no shadows despite the firelight. Each bore the mark of their death, throat wounds, chest injuries, or simply the pallid complexion of those who had been drained of blood. "We've been waiting for you," said a small boy near the window, no more than 6 years old. "The old Keeper grows weak. The house knows it needs a new master." "I won't do it," Elena insisted. "I won't continue this evil." William drifted closer. "Then you'll join us. The binding takes all who refuse its terms." "There must be another way," Elena said, rising from the bed to pace again. "You said destroying the doorway requires a different kind of sacrifice. What sacrifice?" The ghost children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. "The willing sacrifice of a Morales," she said softly. "Not taken, but given. Blood freely offered to close what blood unwillingly taken has kept open." Elena stopped pacing. "You mean I would have to die?" William finished simply. "By your own hand at the altar with the ritual blade. Your blood, Keeper's blood, freely given, would seal the doorway forever." "But," Margaret added quickly, "no Morales has ever chosen such a path. The power they gain is too seductive, the wealth too great." Elena sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "And if I just leave? Walk away without accepting the role of keeper? The binding will claim you anyway," said a teenage girl near the door, her spectral form more faded than the others. "Distance doesn't matter. It will pull your soul back here to join us in servitude. So my choices are to become a murderer, to die, or to become a ghost?" Elena asked bitterly. The children nodded in solemn unison. Elena pressed her hands to her temples, trying to think clearly, despite the horror of her situation. "Tell me more about this doorway. What exactly is it? Where does it lead?" The ghost children shifted uncomfortably, many of them fading slightly as if retreating from the question. "We don't know," Margaret finally admitted. "We only know it hungers, and our blood feeds it, and the Keeper draws power from it. But you've never seen what's beyond it," Elena pressed. William shook his head. "Only the Keeper sees beyond the doorway. The rest of us, we just feel it pulling at us, always pulling, like it wants to draw us through completely." A terrible suspicion formed in Elena's mind. What if there is no entity? What if my uncle, and his father before him, invented this story about a doorway to justify their murderous rituals? What if it's just magic powered by innocent blood, nothing more? "It's real," insisted a boy standing near the fireplace, his clothes suggesting he had died in the 1890s. "We can feel it, like a hole in the world." Elena stood again, a new determination hardening her features. "I need to see this doorway for myself, not during a ceremony, but alone. I need to understand what we're dealing with." The ghost children exchanged alarmed glances. "It's not safe," Margaret warned. "Not without the protection of being Keeper. The hunger might take you." "I'll risk it," Elena replied firmly. "I need to know the truth before I can decide what to do." William moved to the bedroom door, placing his translucent hand against it. "They'll have guards posted. Mr. Heirs never sleeps on ceremony nights." "Is there another way to the basement? A servant's staircase, perhaps?" Elena asked. Margaret nodded slowly. "Behind the pantry in the kitchen. It's narrow and seldom used now, but it leads down to the wine cellar, which connects to the main chamber." "Will you show me?" Elena asked. The ghost children conferred silently again, their forms rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Finally, Margaret stepped forward. "I will guide you," she said solemnly. "But if the hunger notices you—" She left the threat unspoken. Eleanor looked around the room at the gathered spirits, their young faces bearing the weight of decades of suffering. "If I succeed, if I find a way to end this, you'll all be free?" "We hope so," William said, his voice barely a whisper. "No one has ever tried to close the doorway before." Elena moved to the wardrobe and changed into darker clothing, a navy blue skirt and black blouse she found hanging inside. She slipped her feet into sturdy boots, then turned to Margaret. "I'm ready," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Margaret drifted toward the door. "Follow me. Step exactly where I step." The old boards creak in certain places. Elena followed the ghost child into the darkened hallway, the other spirits dispersing like mist, some fading through walls, others seeming to dissolve into shadow. Only William remained with them, taking up a position behind Elena as if to guard their retreat. The house was deathly quiet as they descended the servants' staircase at the back of the main floor. Occasionally, Elena thought she heard distant moaning or whispering from behind closed doors, but Margaret urged her forward, allowing no pause for investigation. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint glow of banked coals in the massive cast-iron stove. Margaret led Elena past rows of copper pots hanging from ceiling hooks and shelves lined with china and preserves, to a narrow door, partially hidden behind stacked flour sacks. "The servant stares," Margaret whispered, though as a ghost all her words had an ethereal quality that seemed unlikely to alert any living person. Careful of the third step, it's rotted through. The staircase was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for Elena's shoulders, and steep enough to require careful footing in the near-total darkness. She descended slowly, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance, the other extended before her to prevent collision with unseen obstacles. The air grew colder and damper with each step, carrying that same metallic scent Elena had noticed during her earlier venture below. After what seemed like hundreds of steps, far more than should have been possible in a normal house, they emerged into a vaulted wine cellar lined with dusty bottles in wooden racks. "This way," Margaret guided, drifting toward a section of wall that appeared solid until she passed straight through it. Eleanor hesitated, then reached out tentatively. Her hand met no resistance, passing through what appeared to be stone but was evidently an illusion. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and found herself in a narrow passageway lit by a single guttering torch in a wall sconce. "A hidden entrance," William explained, materializing beside her, "for the servants who prepared the chamber but weren't permitted to witness the ceremonies." The passageway curved gently downward, leading them deeper beneath the house. As they progressed, Elena noticed more symbols carved into the walls, similar to those she had seen in the ritual chamber, but older, their edges worn smooth by time and touch. "These aren't Spanish or Latin," she observed, tracing one with her fingertip. "What language is this?" "Older than any living tongue," Margaret replied. "The first Morales didn't create the symbols. He found them, like the doorway itself." They continued in silence until the passage widened into a small antechamber. Ahead lay a heavy curtain of deep red velvet, beyond which a faint pulsing light was visible. "The chamber lies beyond," Margaret said, stopping. "I cannot go further unless summoned for a ritual." "Nor I," added William, fading slightly, as if the proximity to the main chamber was weakening him. Elena approached the curtain cautiously. "What will I find?" "The altar, the doorway." Margaret's form flickered like a candle in a draught. "Be careful not to touch anything. Don't speak aloud, and whatever you do, don't approach the far wall." The far wall. "Where the doorway opens during ceremonies," William explained, his voice fading as his form grew more transparent. "We can't stay. The hunger pulls at us too strongly here. You must go alone." Both ghost children retreated toward the passageway, their forms becoming increasingly indistinct. "We'll wait for you here," Margaret promised, now little more than a vague outline in the dimness. "But hurry, dawn approaches, and with it your uncle's deadline." Elena steeled herself and pushed aside the velvet curtain, stepping into the chamber beyond. The room was vast, just as she remembered from her earlier glimpse during the ceremony, but now eerily silent and empty of living participants. The stone altar stood in the center, its surface clean but stained a permanent rusty brown from countless rituals. The candles in their iron holders still burned, though many had guttered out, leaving pools of hardened wax. Elena moved cautiously around the perimeter of the room, studying the symbols painted and carved into the walls. They seemed to shift slightly when viewed from the corner of her eye, though when she looked directly at any particular marking, it remained static. The air felt wrong here, heavier than it should be, pressing against her skin like something alive and curious. Each breath required slightly more effort than normal, as if the atmosphere itself was reluctant to enter her lungs. Following the children's warning, Eleanor kept her distance from the far wall, where an archway of black stone stood empty of any door or covering. Beyond it lay only darkness, though as she watched, she thought she detected movement within that void, a subtle shifting, like something enormous turning slowly in a confined space. As she circled the chamber, Elena noticed small objects placed at intervals around the base of the walls. Toys, ribbons, small shoes, and other personal items, presumably belonging to the sacrificed children. Tiny memorials left by who? The staff? Hayes? Or Ricardo himself in some twisted acknowledgement of his victims? A leather-bound book lay open on a stone lectern near the altar, the same book Hayes had read from during the ceremony. Elena approached it cautiously, careful not to touch the pages as she peered at the text. The writing was in multiple languages. Some she recognized as Latin and Spanish, others completely foreign to her. Diagrams and more symbols filled the margins, along with what appeared to be blood-stained fingerprints marking certain passages. As she leaned closer to examine one particularly complex diagram, a cold draught swept through the chamber, causing the remaining candles to flicker wildly. The darkness beyond the stone archway seemed to deepen, to reach outward like extending fingers. A voice, or perhaps multiple voices layered together, whispered from that darkness, "Morales' blood." Elena stumbled backward, nearly colliding with the altar. The voice had not been in her ears, but somehow inside her mind, bypassing her senses entirely. "You are the next keeper," the voice continued, its tone neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow all of these at once. "We have waited for you." "What are you?" Elena asked aloud, despite Margaret's warning about speaking. The darkness within the archway churned, taking on a vague shape that suggested a face, or many faces pressed together, mouths open in silent screams. "We are the hungry ones," came the reply, "the watchers between worlds, the keepers of doors." "What do you want?" Elena demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. A sound like distant, mocking laughter echoed through the chamber. "What we have always wanted. Passage. Release. The blood of innocence thins the veil between worlds. The sacrifice of a willing keeper would tear it completely." Understanding dawned on Elena with horrible clarity. The ghost children had been partially right. A willing sacrifice of Morales' blood would indeed close the doorway, but not in the way they hoped. It wouldn't free them. It would complete whatever terrible purpose this entity had been working toward for decades. "You've been using my family," she accused, manipulating them with promises of power while building toward something else. The darkness pulsed, expanding slightly beyond the confines of the archway. All bargains have terms unspoken. All doorways open both ways, in time. Elena backed toward the velvet curtain, unwilling to turn her back on the entity. "I won't help you. I won't become your keeper." "Then you will join our collection," the voice replied with cold certainty. "One way or another, Morales' blood will serve." As Elena reached the curtain, the darkness surged forward suddenly, stretching toward her like a grasping hand. She flung herself backward through the velvet barrier, colliding with something solid in the antechamber beyond. Hayes stood there, his face twisted with fury, flanked by two of the robed figures from the earlier ceremony. Beyond them, Elena caught a glimpse of Margaret and William, their ghostly forms pressed against the far wall as if trying to escape. "Curious little fool," Hayes spat, gripping Elena's arm painfully. "Your uncle warned you not to come down here unprepared." "You don't understand what you're serving," Elena gasped, still reeling from her encounter with the entity. "It's using all of you, using the Morales family. It wants something far worse than extending my uncle's life." Hayes's expression didn't change. "I understand perfectly well what dwells beyond the doorway. I have served it, and your family, for 30 years. His grip tightened. "And now you will make your choice, Miss Morales. Dawn approaches, and your uncle's strength fades by the minute." They marched Elena back through the main house, up the grand staircase, and to Ricardo's quarters. The old man was not in his sickbed this time, but seated in a high-backed chair near the window, watching the first faint lightening of the eastern sky. His appearance had deteriorated significantly since Elena had last seen him. His skin now had a greyish cast, and his breathing came in shallow, laboured gasps. "Leave us," Ricardo commanded Hayes and the others, his voice barely audible. When they were alone, Ricardo gestured weakly toward a chair opposite his own. "Sit, niece. Our time grows short." Elena remained standing. "I've seen what's behind the doorway. I know what you're really serving." A flicker of surprise crossed Ricardo's ravaged features. "You ventured into the chamber alone and survived with your sanity intact?" He gave a dry chuckle that dissolved into coughing. "Perhaps you are more worthy of the keeper's role than I thought." "Worthy?" Elena spat the word. "That thing isn't granting you power in exchange for innocent lives. It's using you, using our family, to thin what it called the veil between worlds. It wants to come through completely." Ricardo studied her with suddenly sharp eyes. "Of course it does. All entities seek to expand their domain, but the binding prevents it from crossing fully without the willing sacrifice of a keeper." He leaned forward slightly. "That knowledge is what gives us leverage, what has allowed the Morales family to benefit from its power while keeping it contained." "Those children," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly. 57 innocent lives taken for your unnatural longevity." "A necessary exchange," Ricardo replied without remorse. "My father took far more in his time as keeper. I've been economical." He gestured toward the lightening sky. "Dawn approaches, Elena. You must choose. Become the keeper, maintain the binding that both draws power from and contains the entity, or join the bound souls in eternal servitude." Elena moved to the window, watching as the first golden rays of sunlight broke over the Chicago skyline. The snow-covered city was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, early workers making their way through the streets far below. A normal world, unaware of the horror contained within these walls. "There's a third choice," she said quietly. Ricardo's expression darkened. "If you're thinking of the willing sacrifice, abandon that notion immediately. It would not free the bound souls. It would release what lies beyond the doorway into this world." "I wasn't thinking of that," Elena replied, turning to face her uncle. "I was thinking of destroying the house itself." Ricardo's laugh was genuine this time, if brief. "Impossible. The house is merely the physical shell around the chamber, which existed long before any structure stood on this ground. Burn it down, and the chamber would remain, waiting for new keepers to discover it." Elena's brief hope deflated. "Then what can be done? I won't become a murderer, and I won't free whatever waits beyond that doorway." Ricardo's gaze grew calculating. "Perhaps there is another way, not to end the binding, but to change its terms." He struggled to his feet, shuffling to a bookcase where he retrieved a small key from behind a false panel. "In my study, there is a hidden compartment beneath the desk. Inside, you'll find my personal grimoire, my additions to the family book. I've spent decades searching for alternatives." Elena took the key reluctantly. "Why would you help me change what has given you extended life?" A strange expression crossed Ricardo's face, something almost like regret. "Because 60 years is long enough to learn that some prices are too high, even for near immortality." He sank back into his chair, visibly exhausted by the small exertion. "Go quickly. When the sun clears the horizon completely, my time is ended one way or another." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before hurrying from the room. The upstairs hallway was empty, though she could hear movement from the floor below, the staff beginning their daily routines. She found Ricardo's study locked, but the key she held opened it easily. The study was smaller than she expected, its walls lined with books on occult subjects, its air heavy with the scent of leather bindings and old paper. The massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface bare except for a single silver letter opener shaped like a miniature version of the ceremonial dagger. Kneeling, Elena examined the underside of the desk, finding the hidden compartment exactly as Ricardo had described. The grimoire within was smaller than the ceremonial book from the chamber, bound in dark brown leather that felt unsettlingly like human skin beneath her fingers. Elena carried it to the desk and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Ricardo's cramped handwriting, diagrams, and notes in multiple languages. Many entries were dated, chronicling his experiments and research over decades. The most recent entries were near the end, dated just months earlier. She skimmed quickly, aware of the rising sun and the deadline it represented. Much of the content was incomprehensible to her, references to esoteric concepts and entities she had never heard of, but certain passages stood out. November 12th, 1912. Failed attempt to substitute animal blood. Subject expired within hours. Power gain negligible. The entity requires human innocence, as suspected. December 25th, 1912. Significant discovery. The binding appears to respond to intent as much as blood. The orphan girl's willing participation, though obtained through deception, yielded greater power than usual. Possibility. Could a willing but non-fatal sacrifice suffice? The final entry, dated January 3rd, 1913, just days before Ricardo had summoned her to Chicago, contained what appeared to be a modified ritual, extensively annotated and corrected. Theory. The binding requires Morales' blood and innocent blood, but not necessarily separate individuals or death. A Morales keeper who is themselves innocent might satisfy both requirements through non-fatal bloodletting at regular intervals. The chamber responds to patterns and symbols as much as the physical components. Worth attempting before my strength fails completely. Eleanor read the ritual instructions carefully. If Ricardo's theory was correct, she might be able to maintain the binding, keeping the entity contained without taking innocent lives. Instead, she would offer her own blood, regularly but in non-fatal amounts. The catch, of course, was that she would be bound to the house for life, unable to leave for more than a day or two without the binding weakening. And there was no guarantee Ricardo's untested theory would work. A knock at the study door startled her. Hayes's voice came through. "Miss Morales, your uncle is failing rapidly. The time for decision is now." Eleanor gathered the grimoire and hurried back to Ricardo's quarters. The old man had deteriorated, even in the short time she'd been gone, his breathing now a shallow rattle, his eyes sunken deeper into their sockets. "I found it," she said, showing him the marked passage. "Will this work?" Ricardo's eyes focused on the page with effort. "Untested," he whispered, "but theoretically sound. You would need to be completely untouched by darkness, pure of intent." "I am," Elena insisted. "I've never harmed anyone. I've never wanted to." Ricardo studied her face, seeming to look beyond her physical features to something deeper. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but the binding will test that claim more thoroughly than I can." His gaze shifted to the window, where the sun now cleared the horizon completely, its light streaming into the room. "It's time." Hayes entered without knocking, his face grim as he assessed Ricardo's condition. "The chamber is prepared," he announced. "The transition must happen now." With surprising gentleness, Hayes helped Ricardo to his feet. The old man could barely stand, leaning heavily on the attorney as they made their slow way from the room. Elena followed, clutching the grimoire to her chest like a shield. The house seemed to watch their procession as they descended the main staircase. The ghost children appeared at intervals, lining the route, their translucent faces solemn. Among them, Elena spotted Margaret, who gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. In the library, the tapestry had been pulled aside, revealing the basement door standing open. The stone staircase beyond was now fully illuminated with torches, transforming what had been a frightening descent into an almost ceremonial pathway. The main chamber was prepared differently than Elena had seen it before. The altar remained at the center, but the floor around it had been marked with elaborate symbols drawn in white chalk. Candles burned at specific points within the design, their flames perfectly still, despite the drafts that should have disturbed them. Hayes helped Ricardo to a position near the altar, then stepped back to join the other robed figures who formed a loose circle around the ceremonial space. Ricardo beckoned Elena forward. "The choice remains yours," he said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his physical weakness. "Become the keeper under the traditional terms, become the keeper under the modified ritual you discovered, or refuse and join the bound." Elena looked around the chamber, at the expectant faces of Heirs and the other participants, at the ghost children gathered in the shadows, at the dark archway where something waited hungrily. Then she looked down at the grimoire in her hands, at Ricardo's desperate final research. "I choose the modified ritual," she announced clearly. "I will become keeper, but on new terms. No more children will die in this house." A murmur ran through the assembled figures. Heirs stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. "This is unprecedented. The traditional ritual has maintained the binding for generations. We cannot risk—" "Silence!" Ricardo commanded, and despite his physical frailty, Heirs immediately obeyed. "The choice is hers to make. The binding will accept it or reject it." Ricardo gestured Elena to the altar. "Place the grimoire there. The ritual modifications must be visible during the transition." Elena did as instructed, opening the book to the relevant page. Ricardo moved to stand opposite her, the altar between them, his hands gripping its edges for support. "The ceremonial blade," he requested, and Heirs reluctantly brought forward the curved dagger Elena had seen during the earlier ritual. Ricardo took it with trembling hands. "Traditionally, I would use this to spill your blood, marking you as the new keeper while my life force transferred to you." He held the blade flat across his palms, offering it to Elena. "Instead, you must use it yourself, offering your blood willingly while I relinquish my position." Elena hesitated only briefly before taking the dagger. Its handle was warm, as if it had been lying in the sun rather than in this cold underground chamber. "What do I do?" she asked. Ricardo pointed to the grimoire. "Follow the modified ritual exactly. The intent matters as much as the actions." Elena read the instructions, then held the blade above her left palm. The chamber had gone absolutely silent, even the ghost children watching with wide, hopeful eyes. "I, Elena Morales, offer myself as keeper," she recited from the grimoire. "My blood freely given, my intent pure. I bind myself to maintain the separation between worlds, to hold the hungry ones at bay, to protect the innocent from harm." She drew the blade across her palm, wincing at the sharp pain. Blood welled immediately, dripping onto the altar stone where it seemed to be absorbed instantly, leaving no visible trace. As the first drops touched the stone, Ricardo gasped, his body going rigid. "Repeat the final line," he urged through clenched teeth. "Quickly! I bind myself to maintain the separation between worlds." Elena repeated, her voice stronger. "To hold the hungry ones at bay, to protect the innocent from harm." The chamber began to tremble, dust raining down from the ceiling. The candles flared suddenly, their flames shooting upward nearly to the ceiling before extinguishing all at once, plunging the room into darkness, save for a red glow emanating from the altar stone where Elena's blood had fallen. In the darkness, Ricardo made a choked sound, not of pain but of release. Elena felt something pass from him to her, not a physical sensation, but a weight of responsibility and knowledge suddenly pressing down on her consciousness. Generations of Morales secrets, the true nature of the binding, the history of the entity beyond the doorway, all flooded into her mind in an instant, threatening to overwhelm her. Simultaneously, she became aware of the house above in its entirety, every room, every occupant, every ghost child bound to its service. She could feel the binding itself, a complex web of energy and obligation extending from her through the house to the doorway and beyond to whatever waited on the other side. Most disturbingly, she could feel the entity's attention fix on her like a physical touch, probing, testing, seeking weaknesses in her resolve. It pushed against the binding, testing its new keeper, searching for any darkness or hesitation in her heart that it could exploit. Elena stood firm, mentally reinforcing her stated intent. No more children would die. The binding would be maintained through her sacrifice alone. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the outcome hung in balance. Then, with a sound like a distant sigh, the entity retreated slightly. The binding settled into a new configuration, centered on Elena, maintained by her will and the promise of her blood. Light gradually returned to the chamber, not from the candles, which remained extinguished, but from a soft glow that seemed to emanate from Elena herself. In that gentle illumination, she saw Ricardo collapsed on the floor, his body empty of the unnatural life force that had sustained it for so long. He appeared peaceful in death, the lines of cruelty and calculation smoothed from his features. Heirs and the other robed figures had backed against the walls, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. And the ghost children. Eleanor gasped as she saw them. They appeared more solid than before, their forms no longer flickering or transparent. Margaret stepped forward, looking down at her own hands in wonder. "We're not free," the ghost girl said softly, "but something has changed. The hunger doesn't pull at us so strongly now. The binding has been modified," Elena explained, understanding flowing from her new knowledge. "You're still connected to the house, but no longer as sacrifices. Now you're guardians, I think, helping to maintain the separation." William approached, hope evident on his young face. "Does this mean no more children will die?" "None," Elena promised firmly. "I will maintain the binding with my own blood. No one else will be harmed." Hayes finally found his voice. "This is unprecedented," he repeated, but the anger had left his tone, replaced by uncertainty. "How will you maintain the Morales business interests, the social obligations?" Yelena turned to him, seeing him clearly now, not just as Ricardo's attorney, but as a willing participant in decades of atrocities. "The businesses will be restructured," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Those who wish to remain in my employment may do so, under new terms. Those who prefer to leave—" She glanced meaningfully at the ceremonial robes he and the others still wore. Understanding her implication, Hayes bowed stiffly. "I will, of course, assist with the transition, Miss Morales. Or should I say, Keeper Morales." "Just Miss Morales will suffice," Elena replied coolly. "We begin a new chapter for this house, Mr. Hayes, one with very different rules." As dawn fully broke over Chicago, Eleanor felt the house settling around her, adjusting to its new keeper and the modified binding. The ghost children dispersed, moving more freely through the chambers than they had before, their faces reflecting cautious hope rather than eternal suffering. Elena knew her life had been irrevocably altered. She was bound to this house, to Chicago, to a responsibility she had never sought. The entity beyond the doorway would continue to test her, to seek weaknesses, to hunger for freedom. She would spend the rest of her life maintaining the binding, offering her blood at regular intervals to keep the separation intact. But as she climbed the stone staircase back to the main house, Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction. The cycle of child sacrifices that had sustained the Morales fortune for generations had ended. Whatever personal freedom she had sacrificed, whatever burden she had assumed, that single fact made it worthwhile. Margaret waited for her at the top of the stairs, more solid now, but still unmistakably a ghost. "The others want to know," she said hesitantly, "if we'll ever be able to move on, to whatever comes after." Eleanor wished she could offer false hope, but her new knowledge included the limitations of what she had accomplished. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "The binding has changed, but not broken. Perhaps in time I'll find a way to release you completely." Margaret nodded, apparently unsurprised. "Until then," she said with the faintest smile, "at least we'll have company, and no more will join us unwillingly." "No more," Elena agreed, stepping into the library where the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. "That much, I promise." Spring arrived in Chicago with unusual warmth that year, melting away the last remnants of winter and coaxing green shoots from the earth. Elena stood at the window of her study, formerly Ricardo's, watching gardeners prepare the grounds of Morales Manor for the coming season. 3 months had passed since she had assumed the role of keeper. 3 months of profound adjustment and cautious restructuring. The most immediate change had been the dismissal of Heirs. Despite his protests about contractual obligations and his value to the Morales enterprises, Elena had been adamant. He had been given a generous severance and clear instructions never to return to the property. The other ritual participants had likewise been removed from the household, replaced by staff who knew nothing of what lay beneath the mansion. Only Mrs. Crawford had been permitted to stay, her position complicated by her history as both victim and enabler. The housekeeper had lost a son to Ricardo's rituals decades earlier, yet had continued in service, facilitating countless more sacrifices. When confronted, she had broken down, revealing how the binding had drawn her back whenever she attempted to leave, how Ricardo had threatened worse fates if she interfered. "I could have done more," the older woman had admitted, her normally stern face crumpled with long suppressed grief. "Found ways to warn families, to save some of them, but fear makes cowards of us all, Miss Morales." Elena had neither absolved nor condemned her, instead assigning her to new duties that kept her far from the library and its hidden entrance. A knock at the study door interrupted Elena's thoughts. Martha, the new secretary Elena had hired to help manage the Morales business affairs, entered with a stack of correspondence. "The usual appeals for charitable donations, Miss Morales," Martha reported, placing the letters on the desk. "And the bank requires your signature on these documents regarding the trust fund." Elena nodded, turning from the window. The business of managing the Morales fortune had proven less daunting than expected, partly because her new knowledge included Ricardo's financial expertise, and partly because Eleanor had immediately redirected significant portions of the wealth toward worthy causes. The meatpacking business had been sold, the proceeds establishing a foundation to benefit Chicago's orphans and street children. The remaining investments, largely in real estate and railroads, provided more than enough income to maintain the house and support Elena's more modest lifestyle. "Also," Martha continued, "Dr. Bennett has arrived for your monthly appointment." Elena unconsciously touched the bandage on her left forearm, covering the most recent ritual cut. "Thank you, Martha. Please show him to the green parlor." After the secretary departed, Elena retrieved a small leather journal from a locked drawer. Inside, she had been documenting her experiences as keeper, alongside her ongoing research into the binding and its history. The modified ritual had proven effective. The entity remained contained, the ghost children were no longer in constant torment, and Elena had suffered no ill effects beyond the expected blood loss and a strange connection to the house itself. That connection manifested in various ways. She could sense the location of every occupant, living or dead, within the mansion's walls. She knew immediately if anyone approached the hidden entrance to the basement chamber. Most significantly, she could communicate with the ghost children more clearly than before, not just seeing and hearing them, but sometimes perceiving their thoughts directly. Elena closed the journal and headed downstairs to meet Dr. Bennett, a discreet physician who believed he was treating her for a rare blood condition requiring regular therapeutic bleeding. The truth, of course, was that Elena needed to make her ritual blood offering exactly every 30 days, maintaining the binding with her willing sacrifice. The green parlor was the brightest room in the house, with large windows facing south and east, catching the morning sun. Eleanor had chosen it deliberately for these appointments, preferring light and warmth for what was necessarily an unpleasant procedure. Dr. Bennett, a kindly man in his 50s, was unpacking his medical bag when Elena entered. "Good morning, Miss Morales. How are you feeling since our last session?" "Well enough," Elena replied, taking a seat on the divan and rolling up her sleeve. "The dizziness passed quickly last time." "Excellent. I've adjusted the amount we'll take today, slightly less than before, and I must insist again that you consider iron supplements. He prepared his equipment with practiced efficiency. As the doctor worked, Elena's mind drifted to her ongoing research. The grimoire had provided a starting point, but she had expanded her investigation, corresponding with scholars of occult history and anthropology, seeking any information about similar bindings or entities elsewhere in the world. One promising lead had come from a professor at the University of Chicago who specialized in Native American history. The land where Morales Manor stood had once been considered sacred or forbidden by the local tribes. Stories spoke of a thin place where spirits could pass between worlds, a place that had been sealed by shamans using rituals that required renewal with each generation. The parallels to the Morales binding were striking, suggesting Ricardo's discovery might actually have been an intrusion into a much older spiritual arrangement. After Dr. Bennett finished and departed, Elena made her way to the library. Since becoming keeper, she had transformed this room into a research center, filling the shelves with books on occult history, comparative religion, and ancient languages. The ghost children often gathered here, particularly Margaret and William, who had appointed themselves Elena's primary assistants. "How was your appointment?" Margaret asked, materializing beside a reading table where several open books lay waiting. "The same as always," Eleanor replied, rubbing her bandaged arm. "Dr. Bennett continues to worry about my condition." William appeared on the other side of the table, his spectral form more defined than it had been months earlier. All the ghost children had gradually become more substantial under the new arrangement, able to interact with their environment in limited ways, turning pages, moving small objects, even writing with concentration. "We've been studying the text you found in Latin," he reported, pointing to an ancient volume Elena had obtained from a collector in Boston. "The passage about hungry ones seems similar to what lies beyond our doorway." Eleanor examined the page. "Good work. This describes them as devourers of possibility, entities that consume potential futures." She frowned. "That aligns with what I sensed during the rituals, a consciousness that feeds on choices unmade, lives unlived." "Like ours," Margaret said softly. Eleanor nodded grimly. Each ghost child represented decades of unlived life, experiences that would never happen, exactly the kind of possibility the entity seemed to crave. The binding had settled into a new pattern, but Eleanor wasn't satisfied with merely maintaining it. She sought a permanent solution, a way to close the doorway forever without releasing what waited beyond, while also freeing the ghost children to whatever afterlife should have been theirs. "I found something else," William said, moving to another book, "about thresholds and crossing points. It says some doorways can be sealed permanently if the correct symbols are carved into the framework on both sides." "Both sides," Elena repeated thoughtfully. "That's the challenge. We can modify our side easily enough, but how do we affect the other side without allowing the entity through?" Before either ghost could respond, Elena felt a familiar cold pressure at the edge of her awareness. The entity was active, testing the binding as it did periodically. She closed her eyes, focusing on reinforcing the separation, visualizing the boundary between worlds as impenetrable. The pressure increased momentarily, then subsided, leaving behind an impression of patient malevolence. The entity was learning, adapting to the new arrangement, searching methodically for weaknesses. "It's getting stronger," Margaret observed, her form wavering slightly with the residual energy. "Or more determined." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, opening her eyes, "which means we need to work faster." By late summer, Elena had established a new routine and public identity in Chicago society. To the outside world, she was Ricardo Morales' reclusive niece and heir, a wealthy young woman with progressive ideas and a passion for charitable work. Her foundation for orphaned children had earned her a reputation for generosity, though she rarely attended social functions and never stayed away from the mansion overnight. The truth, of course, was far more complex. Her monthly blood rituals maintained the binding, but each encounter with the entity left Elena increasingly certain that it was growing stronger or more knowledgeable. The pressure against the binding had become more focused, more strategic, targeting specific points rather than pushing broadly against the entire structure. On a sweltering August evening, Elena sat in the garden behind the mansion, enjoying a rare moment of peace as twilight descended. The ghost children played among the rose bushes, not the carefree play of living children, but a quieter, more solemn imitation. Still, it was a vast improvement from their previous existence, and Elena took satisfaction in their relative contentment. Mrs. Crawford approached with a silver tray bearing iced tea. "A telegram arrived for you, Miss Morales," she said, presenting an envelope alongside the drink. Elena opened it with mild curiosity that quickly transformed into sharp interest. The message was from Professor Hawkins at the University of Chicago, with whom she had been corresponding about Native American sealing rituals. Found reference to similar doorway in Southwest, Hopi ritual, sealed it permanently, details in letter following. Hawkins. "Good news?" Mrs. Crawford inquired, noting Elena's expression. "Potentially," Elena replied, tucking the telegram into her pocket. "A new research lead." As darkness fell, Elena returned to the house, passing through the formal dining room where she rarely ate, preferring the smaller breakfast room with its less oppressive atmosphere. The mansion still felt like Ricardo's domain in many ways, despite her efforts to bring light and air to the gloomy interior. In the library, she found William waiting with unusual agitation, his spectral form flickering more than it had in months. "Something's happened," he announced without preamble. In the chamber, the doorway, it changed somehow. Elena immediately moved to the hidden entrance, William following anxiously. Changed how? Is the binding weakened? Not weakened, but shifted. Margaret noticed it first. The symbols around the archway rearranged themselves when no one was watching. This was troubling news. The symbols carved into the stone archway were integral to the binding, their precise arrangement establishing the terms of separation between worlds. Any change could indicate the entity had found a way to manipulate its side of the doorway. Elena descended the winding staircase, no longer needing a light to find her way. The chamber was empty of living presence, though several ghost children hovered near the archway, including Margaret, who pointed wordlessly at the stone framework. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. Where before the symbols had formed a continuous pattern around the arch, now there were distinct breaks in the sequence, creating what appeared to be deliberate gaps in the binding structure. "When did this happen?" Eleanor asked, examining the changes without touching the stone. "Sometime today," Margaret replied. "We check regularly, as you asked. It was normal this morning." Elena felt a chill, despite the summer heat that penetrated even this far underground. The entity was becoming more proactive, not just testing the binding, but actively working to modify it. This was a significant escalation.